Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Electricity Association's Conversation webinar series. I'm Dave McKendry, Senior Fellow at the Canadian Electricity Association. I'm pleased to be your host for today's session. The CEA has been working with our corporate partners to develop this conversation series, which focuses on solutions to current and future challenges faced by our industry. Today, EATON will be presenting fleet management for intelligent electronic devices. As part of their smart grid initiatives, utilities have been deploying large numbers of intelligent electronic devices to implement advanced automation systems. However, they are discovering the high cost of maintaining these devices. Originally considered an essential, capital-intensive, projects in the electrical sector have been seeing increasing operational costs as utilities are faced with devices that require complex commissioning as well as regular firmware updates and security patches. In the same manner, operators of large vehicle fleets have implemented fleet management programs supported by advanced software. Utilities must now look for automated solutions to manage their intelligent electronic devices in fleets in order to tackle ever-increasing operational expenses. In this presentation, we will discuss some of the basic functions required for managing large fleets of intelligent electronic devices, the solutions that have been developed to help utilities meet North American Electric Reliability Corporation Critical Infrastructure Protection, or NERC-CIP, cybersecurity requirements, and how these solutions can also be applied to help utilities manage the intelligent electronic devices being deployed in distribution automation systems. Our presenter today is Patrick Cossette, Product Manager with EATON's EAS Division, Substation Automation. And before we get started, please feel free to type any questions into the webinar area on your webinar screen, and we'll ask those questions at the end of our session, and we will be sending out a copy of this presentation after the webinar, along with the post-webinar survey. We certainly appreciate your feedback. We're also interested in any topics you would like to see as a part of this conversation series. And with that introduction, Patrick, we'll now turn the webinar over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Good day, everybody. So the topic today about fleet management for intelligent electronic devices. So all utilities have those devices, being protection relays, DFRs, and so on. And we're seeing more and more of them. So increasingly large number of them are being deployed. What was initially believed to be capital intensive, so initial costs, and then kind of forget about them, we're seeing more and more operational costs associated with them. These devices are complex by nature, so they require quite a bit of commissioning to put them in service, but also there is a high cost of maintenance associated with these more and more intelligent devices, such as regular firmware updates, security patches, and so on. So a word about fleet management. It's a term that actually comes more from vehicle fleet management. So for a good number of years, the vehicle industry has developed some advanced software that would help their customers manage their fleet or their ensemble of vehicles. So the same can be applied to any types of devices or equipments that you need to manage. Utilities are now looking in ways to automate that management of IDs for all the reasons that we saw in the previous slides. We need to first talk about today's technology. So utilities are adapting with today's technology. So devices are being more and more intelligent. They're providing more information. They can be interconnected to provide advanced functions such as FLISR, so fault location, isolation, and service restoration, but also provide real-time network reporting and monitoring, or other advanced applications such as volt-VAR optimization and control. So of course, technology evolution leads to a lot of benefits, but it also brings important new operational challenges. So devices in various networks are actually built from different vendors. And that's one of the key challenges where utilities are deploying devices on a best of breed basis mostly. So they will come from a variety of vendors. Yet customers, whenever they buy those devices, they actually expect them to work and interoperate together almost seamlessly, but we all know it's not exactly what happens. And of course, we also somewhat expect all those devices to communicate and work always in a secure and reliable manner. This leads into kind of an important change in paradigm because OT, so operational technology, so the operational side of the business, whenever they were to acquire or buy devices and deploy them, they would expect them to be a long-lasting investment. Typically back, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was essentially simple technology. And more as technology advanced in the OT side, it remained with pretty much simple protocols, interfaces, little or no security attached with those devices. And typically people, protection engineers and administrators would not typically expect to change those devices, at least not in the foreseeable future. So it was essentially an investment for at least 20 years whenever they bought some equipments and put them in service. Now, if we switch to the IT world, so information technology, we all know probably in your business that it's much more dynamic than that. So devices, even in our own household, uh, we can relate to the fact that a hardline phone, the phone that you actually had, if those still exist today, you had in your home, you didn't expect it to change it all that often. It was there, it was hanging on the wall. You expected to be able to make and receive phone calls. Sorry, and that's pretty much it. As opposed to today's technology where everybody's got an iPhone or the equivalent, so they have a much shorter life expectancy. So, but they do bring a lot to the table in terms of convenience and functionalities, but they are much more complex. So you can relate to the fact that you need to update firmware once in a while. So once per month or so, Apple will come out with a new version. You're expected to upgrade your device. Unfortunately, it's pretty much the same in the utility business where devices that have been put in service, although it's been just a couple of years, now the vendor requires you to apply a firmware patch or a security patch or to upgrade some settings to address various security vulnerabilities, or just to be able to enable new features that you want to implement in the device. In a worst case scenario, you even have component obsolescence. So even devices are need to be replaced much quicker than they used to be just a few years before that. So each new generation of devices, they implement new technologies, new protocols, new ways to interconnect with those devices, even though in the end, they still, a protection relay will continue to protect, but all the features and the interfaces, they keep evolving. So if we focus for a while just on the IT side, talk about device lifecycle. So in the IT world, it's as if they're kind of used to that. So in order to manage an IT network of devices, so routers and switches and so on, they already have what's called network management systems. It's advanced applications that will actually help network administrators manage their fleet of IT devices, so those routers and switches and so on. Typically, any type of industry, their IT department will typically select from a single vendor. So Cisco comes to mind as a very popular brand, where a lot of customers, they will stick to one vendor because it's just simpler to manage that way. And you kind of expect all those devices from the same manufacturer to work well together. And along with those management systems from that vendor, another different vendor, they're all expected to play well together. And it even goes to a point where configuring and commissioning those devices, it's almost plug and play, at least today. So whenever you bring a new switch on your network or a new router, a well-designed system will integrate that new device almost seamlessly, so it'll be plug and play. Now, the same paradigm for the life cycle, but on OT side, it's a totally different path. You have to keep in mind that a protection relay, I'll use that as an example quite often, but a protection relay, it's a type of device that its first and foremost job or function is really to protect the electrical network, not to communicate. Communicating and supplying information is just a benefit of using that device, but it's definitely not its primary job, as opposed to most devices on the IT side. As I was mentioning earlier, engineers, they typically tend to select the best of breed. So that'll lead to a network of devices that comes from a variety of vendors. They are selected and picked according to functional capabilities, so protecting, not so much necessarily about communicating and being able to be managed. So in the end, whenever you commission and manage those devices, it requires numerous operations. So commissioning a device is definitely not plug and play. There's a long list of tests and commissioning steps that need to be undertaken. And you end up with probably as many proprietary software as you have different device types, even from the same manufacturer. So you end up, if you want to manage your network of devices, anybody that says that can manage all their devices, that means that they have the knowledge and they have access to all the different platforms and software that comes from the various, as many vendors as those devices. So, but today those devices, it would be nice if these devices, they were the same or they were kept for a long time. But as I was mentioning earlier, they're no longer static. So you need to change them, you need to upgrade them, so they need to be maintained, updated, as well as replaced. And it's not as if their numbers are going down. I mean, they're definitely going up. So because now you have more and more applications that are being developed in order to improve the electrical network performance. So you'll attach more and more monitoring devices, more and more protection relays, of course, but digital fault recorders, monitoring devices, meters, and so on. A lot of these devices just a few years ago weren't necessarily connected, so you had no remote way of connecting to those devices. But now they're slowly but surely being all connected to your network. Although a lot of utilities are still managing those devices manually, it's no longer a cost-effective way of doing so. So in the end, you do need some form of automatic configuration management. So the vision of IoT, you probably heard that acronym, so the Internet of Things. It's a vision, it's out there, anything plug and play and zero touch deployment. It's being, it's a vision, it's being promised for a good number of years, and it's probably on its way, but it's definitely not here as of today. So commissioning electrical controls is much more complex, and it will remain that way for a good number of years. Although there's light at the end of the tunnel, there are some efforts in terms of trying to standardize the management approach with those devices. So such protocols such as DMP3 and mostly IEC 61850, they're definitely moving in the right direction. So more and more vendors are allowing their devices to be managed externally by different vendor applications using those protocols. So hopefully it's the vision is to be able to be interoperable. So in other terms, having applications or systems from different vendors being able to talk and manage devices from other vendors. So if we focus a little bit on managing devices inside the fence, so essentially substation automation, mostly in transmission, but it can also apply to larger distribution substation, but I'll focus mostly on transmission here. So what can characterize a substation automation environment? So it's, of course, a large number of IDs, of devices from a variety of vendors, as mentioned before. So protection, metering, monitoring, and communication equipments. Sorry. So transmission substations, because probably mostly of their budgets, they were the first to automate, to implement automated device management systems for two main reasons. The first was to reduce operational costs, and the second, and probably the most important one, or at least the main driver, was really to meet compliance requirements, and we're going to touch that shortly. But one of the first applications that we really saw automation kick in was the ability to retrieve power system event and fault data from digital fault recorders. So oscillography reports, sequence of events, any type of fault data. So that's really one of the first applications to be fully automated. The goal was, of course, partially to comply with NERC PRC, but also to be able to restore power during after an outage, to restore power faster. Because if utilities and the engineers are able to capture the data faster and much more efficiently, so essentially saving truck rolls, they're able to put the power back on whenever they understand the fault or the event that just occurred. The second application that came right after that, I would say, is remote management of devices. So actually on a one-on-one basis, so it's not necessarily automated, but because the communication network that was deployed to address the first application, so retrieving default data, because a lot of utilities put in place TCP/IP networks all the way to the substations, because before those days, a lot of substations weren't necessarily connected using a fiber network or an IP network. They were just connected only for SCADA operations. Now that you have this network, all of a sudden you have access to those devices remotely. So then again, the rationale behind that is they were able to reduce operational costs because they didn't have to drive down to the substation to perform any of those management tasks. However, this quickly introduced a whole new list of security issues. So you can imagine that all of a sudden having access to your substation is really convenient, but at the same time, you really need to address how and who can connect and how you can secure that network. Thankfully enough, NERC in the US, they were quick to address and come up with a series of standards to address all of these issues. So complying with NERC CIP involves much more than just technical requirements. So you can imagine from a networking point of view, so having, encrypted links and making sure everything is secure and all of that, and meeting up to a certain encryption level, all that is very technical, but that's just a small part of it. What it meant for utilities, it meant being able to manage the list of devices they had out there. So a lot of utilities didn't necessarily have a clear list of all devices that were now reachable and accessible for the users. It also means going way beyond just a simple device list, but it means also managing or knowing which firmware versions are deployed. It means managing a list of users who has access to those devices. Um, and defining the permissions to those users. So a protection engineer, for example, might have full access to protection relays, but field technicians might have different privileges onto the same devices or different devices. So you can see it becomes quite complex. And NERC CIP even went beyond that level and said, okay, well, you also need to manage the passwords that those devices are using. And a lot of those devices, they used to have just a factory defaults set. It was really convenient. So a field technician knew exactly what password to use all the time, because it was either the factory default or maybe the utility default. But it was the same for all devices, so it wasn't really secure. So NERC CIP made sure to kind of lock that down. And today you actually need to demonstrate that you're managing your passwords, and every so often, and you need to demonstrate all that using logs and so on. Most large utilities, they already have different systems in place, and they probably had those for a long time. So the first one is some kind of asset management software. And it doesn't need to be fancy. I know a lot of customers that actually use an Excel spreadsheet. Uh, Most now, of course, they use much more advanced asset management software, but these systems essentially are quite often quite static, in the sense that the data that the information that is entered into those systems are whatever the user is actually entering. So if you plug in a new device on your network, it won't be automatically discovered. There's a manual process to add that new device inside the asset management software. In a lot of utilities, they also have on the IT side, the application I was mentioning before. So some form of network management software, that's quite typical. Those applications are great on the IT side, and they're quite mature on that on that end. But for the OT side, these software, these systems are generally unsuccessful in communicating with IT. So they work great with the switches and the routers and computers and servers, but as far as managing and discovering your protection relays and your DFRs, because of a lack of standards in protocols, or at least it's different standards, there is no way to interconnect those systems right now. And even if there was, I mean, these management software wouldn't know what to do with those devices. It's one thing to connect, but as far as extracting the protection settings or managing the passwords on vendors that are typically not from the IT world, poses definitely a big challenge for those applications. So this leads into, of course, device management software that would be designed for the electrical sector. So there's a number of those applications out there on the market, and because they are designed for the electrical sector, they address all the issues that we just mentioned. So they are able to directly communicate with the devices in the field. They will speak the native language, whatever it might be. So it might be the NP3, it might be IEC 62150, those are standards, but you also have a lot of proprietary interfaces or languages out there. So most device management software built for that purpose actually are able to communicate with these devices. Plus, of course, they'll go the step beyond and just not only talk with these devices, but they'll implement a lot of the requirements coming from NERC CIP. So, for example, I won't dive into the details of those, but there's a concept of an intermediate device functionality, essentially meaning that a user doesn't actually directly communicate with a device. He thinks he is, but through a proxy, essentially he's kind of communicating with what seems to be like the device. So his software, his tools, or his interactions with the device are actually are cut short, and you actually talk to what's called an intermediate device, and in turn, that management software will reproduce the steps and actually talk to the end device. This adds a layer of security and greatly protects the devices from unauthorized access. Other requirements trickle down from NERC CIP, centralized user management, role-based access control. So it's a way, role-based access control simply means that your privileges or the actions that you can actually do on a certain device are based on your role. So you might have a role of protection engineer. This will give you, let's say, full access, full administrative access onto all devices. Whereas if you are an IT administrator, maybe you're granted only limited actions on only certain devices in the substation, so on and so forth. And of course, a long list of reports, logs, and monitoring applications comes with that, because being NERC CIP compliant, it's not the management software itself that needs to be compliant. It's not a standard that the vendors of those software, they need to comply to. It's really the end users, so the utilities, that they need to comply. So demonstrating or proving that you are compliant to the CIP standards involves a great number of reports that you need to produce and essentially provide to the auditor whenever utilities are going through an audit. So a device management software essentially implements the device drivers for all common devices. So on the market, in North America, there's only a certain number of key players in terms of devices. So devices from GE, for example, or from Schweitzer are some of the very common ones. Elsewhere in the world, you're going to have other players, of course. So ABB, Siemens. You might see them a little bit in North America, but they're very present in Europe as well as Latin America. So a device management software implements the device drivers for all of these devices. What it typically does, some of the key features, well, it'll be able to retrieve the device settings, essentially reading protection settings, network settings, whatever communication parameters are stored in the device. A management software will be able to retrieve that. It will retrieve also information such as firmware version. It won't retrieve necessarily the firmware itself. There's typically no use case for that, but it's really just capturing what version is it currently running on, and does it have any service packs or updates and so on, as well as serial numbers. So a typical management software will be able to keep track of these settings and pieces of information, both from a configuration, settings, firmware, and hardware point of view. And once you start capturing all that information, then you're able to actually start detecting changes. And that's really where such a system brings a lot of value to a utility where if anything changes out in the field, it will be automatically detected, and you can actually notify the system operators of whenever a change occurs in the field, and probably go up to a level where you can actually highlight and demonstrate, do a side-by-side comparison of some sort to just highlight, okay, here's what you had yesterday, and today here's the change that was detected. Then probably using a workflow management, you can actually either accept, reject, or actually take action based upon those changes. Generating all applicable compliance and operational reports, as I said before, and of course, help meet password management requirements. So specifically for NERC CIP, in just a few words, so NERC CIP will require utilities, at least for their critical devices, that the passwords all be unique. So there's no more sharing between the same password between all devices. Even though it's different from the factory default, it needs to be unique, it needs to be complex, and it needs to be changed every 15 months or so. So let's say annually you need to roll out new passwords. And when I say complex, well, it's all the way up to whatever's supported by the device itself. So legacy or older devices will be very limited in terms of what it means to be a complex password. Whereas newer, more modern equipments, they'll actually require the passwords to be very complex. So all of these operations in terms of password management, if they are done manually, they are, well, quite tedious first, but two, and probably most importantly, they're very much error prone. We've had some customers actually that before implementing an automated password management solution, they were doing it using kind of a glorified Excel spreadsheet. They were generating passwords and in the spreadsheet, copying, pasting that into to their devices. Turns out that there was a very large portion of those devices that, even though the utility, they were sure that the passwords that were deployed in the devices, they were matching whatever was in their Excel spreadsheet, where in reality, for whatever reason, because a human error at some point just during the copy and pasting, they didn't match. So they were essentially stuck. So thankfully enough, whenever you have a local access to your device, you can actually recuperate from that. But essentially they lost remote access to their devices, and in some critical situations it could have been quite dramatic actually, because they thought they had access whereas they didn't actually. So a device management software, of course, can be leveraged, leverages the communication infrastructure that is already in place. So if it's a slow network using still a cellular network, so a large geographical coverage and so on, you can adapt the solutions to pull your devices only once in a while, whereas newer and more modern connections to substations, hopefully using fiber, you can be much more aggressive and get almost a real-time update of all your devices into this management system. So just the cost of trying to be compliant to NERC is a business case in itself for transmission substations. As I said, typically budgets associated with transmission substations is much higher than distribution, but is there still a business case for devices that are used in distribution and automation systems? So transmission substations, large variety of devices, only a few locations, but if for one substation is just one location, whereas distribution automation, you have a large number of devices that are not necessarily all that different. So they're mostly identical. So capacitor bank controllers, for example, or voltage regulators, sensors, and all the equipments that you put out in the distribution automation network will tend to be mostly identical. But of course, the challenge is that you have a much larger geographical area to cover. Remote management as a business case becomes a cost-effective alternative to an expensive truck roll. So every time you have to perform a firmware upgrade, or you need to capture information from all your devices on your distribution network, if you have to drive in a truck to all the poles and the distribution substations to collect the data, there's a strong business case there to implement some form of remote management. So one of the features that can be addressed using a device management system is the bulk settings and firmware updates that would be considered the most common operations. So firmware updates, unfortunately, are the new reality, as I was saying at the beginning. So devices require, the vendor will actually require you to upgrade your devices or apply security patch much more often than it used to be. Just because these devices, well, they're becoming more and more complex, and thus they're exposing, unfortunately, some security vulnerabilities, and that becomes much more important as the utilities start to connect them and make them accessible remotely. So updating settings, so essentially just sending settings update to a number of devices. Typically, that's pretty short and straightforward. That's still manageable manually. But it's a simple operation, takes just a couple of minutes to do per device. Now, updating a firmware, that typically requires a transfer of a much larger data file. If it was done only on one or just a handful of devices, it wouldn't be much of an issue. I mean, you just spend a couple of minutes, you look at the upload, go through and just wait for the device to cycle and all of that, and that's no big deal. But typical distribution utilities might be managing hundreds, if not thousands, of devices. So every minute counts in that case. Just to conclude, the end of this presentation, essentially, this is a summary of all the different functions or the features of a electrical device management system. So for secure remote access, we're talking about centralized user management, various forms of two-factor authentication, access logs, automatic login, and so on. So you see in the second column for substation automation, such a feature would be a requirement by NERC. Routers and switches are just not enough to implement the requirements of NERC SIP. Distribution automation, it's currently not necessarily a requirement, but because devices provide little or no security at all, often sharing the same password, it's mostly seen as a best practice. So means to control and manage remote access is just a cybersecurity best practice. Configuration management, which means second feature, which means retrieving device settings automatically, storing those settings in the database, detecting changes, and so on. For substation automation, transmission utilities, that's a requirement by NERC. System operators must provide reports that firmware has been updated and so on. It can be done manually. SIP doesn't say that you need such a system, but it is a tedious operation to do so. Whereas in distribution automation, again, it's not a requirement, but a centralized database of all the device settings can be a very valuable engineering tool, and especially because all your devices, they tend to be quite similar, if not identical. So you're going to expect all of them to be set to the same firmware version, for example. So having a centralized view of that information, again, can prove to be very valuable. In terms of password management, so we're talking about automatically generating complex passwords and actually updating those devices with those passwords, and having all of that managed centrally. For substation automation, again, that's a requirement by NERC CIP. But again, it can be done manually, but it is tedious and error prone, as I was discussing earlier about the errors that can be inserted whenever you're doing this manually. Distribution automation, I would say that we're starting to see some applications for that, but it's anecdotal at this point. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of distribution utilities, because they're not forced to implement any form of password management, they rely mostly on network security. So switches and routers and firewalls to implement their security. But they're not necessarily deploying or changing the passwords from the default, or if they are, they're just sending a common password to all their devices. So it's not currently a common practice, but it'll tend to change in the coming years because SIP is now applicable for higher voltage distribution substations, but it'll eventually make its way down to lower voltage levels, as well as all equipments in pole top devices. Event retrieval, that was the first application we talked about. So the ability to retrieve fault data, oscillography files and from DFRs and protection relays, store all of that in a centralized database. That's an application that we're seeing mostly in substation automation, not so much in distribution. Although some devices in distribution automation do provide these types of files, we're not seeing it applicable as often. So we're seeing it, it's definitely a requirement required by NERC, but a different standard, so PRC. And again, it can be done manually, but whenever we're talking about thousands of devices, and in order to improve performance indexes as far as power restoration, so SAIDI and KD and so on, utilities, they want to gather that information, get access to it centrally and much more efficiently in order to make rapid decisions. And finally, the last feature, the last function is firmware and settings update. So that's the ability to push settings to devices, as well as, and probably most importantly, the ability to push new firmware versions to all devices. Again, for substation automation, it's required by NERC. But in this case, ironically enough, we're not necessarily seeing these features implemented for transmission utilities because there's too large of a variety of vendors and devices, and it becomes much harder to automate that process. And also combined with the fact that system operators, and especially for firmware deployment, they will often prefer to connect directly and locally. So even though if they have remote access to devices, those devices, and especially protection relays, are too critical to the network to be updated remotely. So they still prefer to do that on a direct connection. And besides, often a lot of those devices, they actually force you to perform the update directly using a local port in front of the device, and you cannot actually do it remotely. So firmware and settings update actually makes a lot more sense on distribution automation applications. So a lot of devices now support some form of over-the-air remote update. So you still have the ability to do it locally, so directly connect to the device, but more and more devices support over-the-air remote updates. And again, as I've been saying a lot of times, but it can be done manually, but it is quite time consuming and tedious. And we've heard of some customers, some utilities that will spend just months, if even doing it remotely, doing it manually on a remote connection can take months to roll out a new firmware version to a lot of devices. So there's a strong business case to automate all of that. And essentially, I think that was it. So I think we can open it up to the Q&A portion.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Patrick. Boy, it's a great umbrella overview you're providing in terms of a holistic approach to the management of all these devices. And I love how you're classifying it as the equivalent of fleet management. That gives a good visual of what you're looking to do. And there are so many different elements within the complexity of the electricity system that you've gone through. For our viewers, please take a moment now. If you'd like to ask a question, just jot it into your web screen, and we'll get to that in due order. And Patrick, we've already got some in, and maybe just to kind of kick things off, you've got a lot of expertise in this area, and from an EATON perspective, maybe you could just give a quick overview of EATON, the actual services and products that you provide, size of company, number of employees, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, EATON is quite a large company. So we're about just shy of 100,000 employees, but it really has a lot of different divisions, different businesses. So it grew by acquisition. So we're personally, we're within the electrical sector of EATON, but it has a vehicle division and so on. So within electrical, we have devices. We actually manufacture a lot of distribution automation equipments. So those capacitor, bank controls, voltage regulators, and so on. And personally, I'm within the division of called EAS, Energy Automation Solutions. So we manufacture and produce software and hardware that helps automate both substation as well as distribution applications.
Great, thank you very much. So Patrick, do you see a convergence of technologies between IT and OT? You discussed quite a bit of that in your presentation. Where do you see that convergence happening?
Yeah, well, yes, definitely. I mean, we're seeing more and more IT players that kind of want to touch on the OT market. Let's put it this way. But the OT market is such a niche market. It's kind of hard for them to get into that field. So the way that we actually foresee it is more of a collaboration between IT, some IT vendors and OT vendors such as us, where various partnerships and collaborations where it's not that one system or one application will take over the other. So applications will stay in their own niche, but they'll definitely share information. I mean, that's today, it's all about open interfaces and sharing information. So just an example, password management, you have the exact same concept on the IT world. So there are strong players in the IT world for password management. So we see a lot of collaboration and partnerships in terms of exchanging information, exchanging passwords. So the customers, they end up with having somewhat of a seamless integrated system in the end.
Where do you see the engagement with your customers, your utilities starting? Is it more on the IT side, or is it more on the operational side, or who's typically the lead on the customer side that you're dealing with?
It depends greatly on what's the driver behind the need for the conversation. So if it's a security compliance requirement, so it'll be a mix of IT, but mostly OT side, where they'll have a compliance team or a compliance division A lot of our customers have those roles defined, so they'll be the ones that'll reach out to us, and because we're seen as a strong player in terms of being able to help them meet those requirements. If it's more of a cost benefit where they want to simplify rolling out firmwares and settings and so on, and just capturing the information, not necessarily for cybersecurity purposes. It's definitely coming from the OT side in that case. So protection engineers, a lot of our champions, or a lot of the people that'll love the product the most and kind of pull us in are really the people that are using it, and they want to use it in a sense that they see a tremendous value in using an applications such as EATON can provide. So we're talking protection engineers, SCADA engineers, and so on.
What's the typical process you utilize when you start to engage with a customer?
For large systems such as the ones that we can provide, often it'll be kind of a formal process. So utilities will go out to an RFP process and actually go ask on the market, and they'll have a bunch of requirements. So a lot of boxes that we need to check in terms of, can you comply and can you do this, and so on. But another way of engaging with the customers is because EATON is also providing equipments for other applications, mostly in the distribution automation market. So we're often pulled in that case where, okay, well, we already have thousands of your devices as well as devices from other manufacturers. How can you help us, manage them? So we can provide tools and the systems that we just discussed. But the need is really, how can you make my life simpler, essentially?
This is going to be one of those questions, how long is a piece of string? But just generally, what do you see in the number of devices being managed? What would it be a number that you're starting to look at the holistic view within a utility? Is it in the thousands, tens of thousands, beyond?
If you would have asked me this question maybe 6-7 years ago, the lower thousands would be a good number. We've deployed systems and helped in different ways for customers that were they wanted to manage just a few hundreds of devices, mostly because not all devices were connected in the first place. So only the critical devices were connected,
Yeah.
transmission utilities. So just a few hundreds, and that was the kind of the ballpark figure. Today, lower thousands is kind of the bare minimum. A lot of utilities, both in transmission, but mostly in distribution applications, we're talking about few thousands, and we actually had some discussions, and we're envisioning some projects where we have hundreds of thousands of devices. Now, if you would have told me this 5 years ago, I would have told you never. I mean, it's almost impossible, but that's where we're at today. So it keeps surprising me just how more and more devices are connected and accessible. So the challenges will keep piling up, that's for sure.
I've heard it said that we used to be in the business of delivering electricity, and we happen to use information technology. Now we're in the information technology business, and we happen to deliver electricity.
True.
Flipped right upside down. Just watching the time, and probably our last question for now. So Patrick, for utilities touching on both transmission and distribution automation, can they share the same device management system, or are they two separate?
Yes, they can. Even though the business case behind it might be quite different, it's really up. These systems, they have to be quite flexible. So a very large utility, the distribution portion of it and the transmission portion of it might almost be different companies and all, so they'll end up having different systems. But for utilities that are all a bit more integrated, there's definitely an advantage to having just one system, and one system can be quite complex and big and multiple servers and so on, but managing just one system in that case, you do have to spend some time in that case defining who has access to what devices. So you maybe don't want your distribution field technicians to have any visibility or access onto transmission equipments or vice versa, but it's definitely a trend where we're seeing more and more utilities trying to leverage the expertise that they build on using such a system and trying to interconnect all the other systems.
Right, and I said that was last. The other one is the management system a cloud-based solution or a prem-based solution?
Right now, it's all on premise. For distribution application, I could see it that in the quite near future, it could be cloud-based. But for transmission utilities, they're quite conservative in terms of the information that they have and the access that they give to any type of external applications. I'm not saying it's impossible, but from a technology point of view, it would simplify the life a lot of vendors like us. But in reality, a lot of transmission utilities are still good old fashioned, they own their own servers, they buy their own licenses, and they operate and they become experts and they manage on premise because it's so critical to them.
Well, that's great. Again, watching the top of the hour, Patrick, a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for this in terms of sharing your expertise, EATON's expertise in the area of fleet management for intelligent electronic devices. It's, again, another one of these very, very complex situations. With that, Patrick, thanks very much. We'll allow you to drop off camera for now. We'll get through our close. Our next corporate partner conversation series webinars will be held on November the 19th. Longview Systems Cloud Security will be presenting a new breed of tools and skill sets. And on December the 1st, Siemens Canada will be presenting electrical infrastructure for e-mobility. So if you've got folks in your team that are involved with the electrification of transportation, you won't want to miss out on December the 1st. All of CEA's future events and actually past events can be found in our monthly newsletter, Current Affairs, or you can go to the news and events section of our website at electricity.ca. Thanks again for joining us, and until next time, bye for now.